A lot of people are sitting towards the back because our TVs on the wall are a little clearer.
Oh, yeah, sure, no problem.
All right, let's get started. Well, thank you all for coming today, and we did broadcast this, so thank you to those of you that are watching from home. Our speaker for our class today is Tane Casserly. He joined the Office of the National Marine Sanctuaries in the spring of 2001. Tane is responsible for the development of policies and programs to address commercial and recreational uses and impacts in and around the sanctuary. Tane's specialties include 19th century warships and deep water archaeology. So please welcome Tane Casserly.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you for Amanda for inviting me. So I do, sorry, I should have done this to start, but I do have a little bit of an unusual name. So it's pronounced Tane. So it's Tane Casserly. My family is from New Zealand, so it's a Polynesian name. So I'm very happy to be here. But today we're going to be talking about World War II and America's doorstep. I'm talking about the U-boats that have happened off the Mid-Atlantic coast. Oh, over here. Um, so I should give you a little bit of background on who we are. So we are part of NOAA, and you probably know us from the National Weather Service. We're the federal agency that does all the weather forecasts that we share at the Weather Channel and local news networks and everybody else. But we're much like the National Park System, except we're on the water. So we're part of 15 national marine sanctuaries that are across the country and two national monuments. We oversee more than 600,000 square miles of marine and Great Lakes waters, from Washington State to the Florida Keys, and from Lake Huron, the Great Lakes, all the way down to American Samoa. But of course, we protect the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary that's off the coast of North Carolina, and the artifacts of which were brought up, and now they're at the Mariners Museum and Park in Newport News, Virginia, which I invite everybody to visit because it's a fantastic museum. So I just want to bring us back to some of the things we're studying now, and that's the shipwrecks surrounding the Monitor off North Carolina, and a lot of these are World War II shipwrecks. So we just celebrated in September, of course, the 76th anniversary of the end of World War II, VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day, which we're very excited to, to herald our veterans and talk about our history. But this is the day that we signed the ceremonial surrender above the USS Missouri in 1945. And today we honor all the World War II veterans, and we remember the sacrifice of over 400,000 Americans and the tens of millions around the world that died during this conflict. There is no other event in human history that had such a profound effect on the geopolitical landscape as World War II did. So I love using this map. It's from World War II, but it really shows how World War II was a global war that for the United States lasted from December 7th, 1941 through September 2nd, 1945. And this map does a great job of showing how the US, in the middle of the map, has its tendrils throughout the entire world where we send the men, women, supplies, ammunition, bandages, food, jeeps, tanks, everything all had to be shipped around the world on cargo ships, primarily done by the U.S. Merchant Marine. Even today, when we fight wars or conflicts overseas, it's these ships that move those materials around. So this is really what we're going to be talking about. So a lot of folks don't know that Germany actually surrendered twice during World War II. Um, the first was an unconditional surrender signed on May 7th, 1945, by the Supreme Headquarters in Reims, France. That was supposed to go into effect the next day on May 8th. But the Soviet Union didn't like the terms and demanded a second separate signing ceremony in Berlin on May 8th. And the news was announced in Moscow on May 9th. So the formal surrender document signed on May 8th, or VE Day as we know it, were written in English, Russian, and German, And besides the addition that Germany disarmed completely, the formal surrender documents signed in Berlin differed very little from those signed in France. And even here, in this time of celebration around the world, we can see the friction starting to grow between the United States and the Soviet Union, which evolved into the Cold War just a few years later. So at this point, after the surrender of Germany, the Allies have two choices to end the war. Choice number one was Operation Downfall. So as early as 1943, American military planners had seen the need to attack the two principal Japanese islands in order to end the war. They expected very stiff resistance, and some estimates of American casualties reached as high as 1 million. So, with the full knowledge of the potential costs, the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved a directive on May 25th, 1945, outlining the overall invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall. It had two phases: invasion of Kyushu to the south, which was called Olympic, you can see it on the map, while assault on Honshu to the north was known as Coronet. And estimates of the Allied force requirements for the entire operation were for some 5 million soldiers overall, all American, which comprised about 40% of all Americans in uniform, except for 3 British Empire divisions. The second choice we faced was the Manhattan Project, which is the top secret race to create the first atomic weapon. Created in 1942 and inspired by refugee scientists from Europe, including Albert Einstein, with Dr. Robert Oppenheimer leading the scientific team, the United States engaged in a secret race to produce an atomic weapon before Germany. Under the Manhattan Project, the US military operated secret plants in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, to produce the uranium and plutonium elements necessary for a bomb. And isolated in remote Los Alamos, New Mexico, a team of physicists worked to create a viable detonation system. The $2 billion project employed over 125,000 people across America, most of whom had no idea what they were working on because it was so secret. And this eventually led to the dramatic Trinity atomic tests in the Mexico desert in July 1945, leaving the United States to face the question, was the atomic bomb a sufficient enough weapon to bring World War II to an end? And as we know, the Allies chose the Manhattan Project. August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb, known as Little Boy, was dropped by the Boeing B-29 Superfortress Enola Gay, 6 miles above Hiroshima, Japan. 43 seconds later, it detonates above the city, and with a single bomb, 40,000 men, women, children are obliterated. 100,000 more die within days. And another 100,000 would succumb to radiation poisoning over the next 5 years. But despite this initial devastation, on August 6th, the Japanese still would not accept the Allied surrender terms, which forced us on August 9th of 1945 to drop a second atomic bomb, the FAT plan, drops on Nagasaki. Again, another 40,000 more civilians die. In Tokyo, the Japanese Supreme Council for the direction of the war remained split between those still determined to fight on and those willing finally to give up. That evening, all 6 members of the council call upon the emperor, who breaks the deadlock. On August 10th, the next day, Japan requests conditional surrender terms, but they are denied because we wanted unconditional surrender. And then finally, after much talk and negotiation, on August 15th of 1945, Japan accepts the Allies' unconditional surrender terms. At the day, it was known as VJ Day, or Victory over Japan Day, or VP Day, Victory in the Pacific Day, ending hostilities in World War II. And the news breaks in the United States on August 14th due to the time zone differences. And here we can see a huge crowd, Times Square in New York City, all celebrating the end of World War II. And just over 2 weeks later, on August 30th of 1945, the Allied occupation of Japan begins. Here's a great photograph showing F-4U and F-6F flying in formation during surrender ceremonies, and you can see actually the USS Missouri there in the background on the left. So on the 2nd of September of 1945, the Japanese signed the ceremonial surrender aboard the USS Missouri. The ceremony, which formally brought an end to the bloodiest conflict in human history, lasted a mere 23 minutes. It began at 9:02 a.m. with a brief opening speech by General Douglas MacArthur, where the general called for justice, tolerance, and the rebuilding of Japan. And after the speech, Foreign Minister Moro Shigemitsu, representing the Emperor of Japan, signed the instruments of surrender. He was followed by the Japanese Chief of Army General Staff, who signed for the Japanese Army. Afterwards, General MacArthur signed the instrument of surrender as the Supreme Allied Commander, and World War II was finally over. So, what does this all mean? This history, what does it mean for Virginia? What does it mean for North Carolina? What does it mean for the Mid Atlantic? Well, this is where my office comes into it, the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary, that protects and honors the Civil War ironclad, the USS Monitor. That shipwreck lies 16 miles off the coast of North Carolina. So we realize that when you look at Monitor, where it sits off the North Carolina coast, and you look at all the shipwrecks around it, these shipwrecks are really telling another story out there, and that's the World War II story. This is where World War II came home to the United States. So let's go back to the start of World War II and see how and why Germany attacked our shores. As we all know, it began on the day of infamy, December 7th, 1941, 7:55 a.m., when the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Military and civilian casualties totaled more than 3,400, including over 2,300 killed, with nearly half of those aboard the USS Arizona. So it's interesting to note that Germany actually didn't declare war against the United States until several days later. So even though that Japan and Germany were allies, they are part of the Axis powers, Germany knew that Japan was going to attack the United States at some point, but because they didn't fully trust each other, they didn't have the exact date. Japan was trying to keep it so secret. So hence the several days difference until Germany actually declares war against the United States, and now we're in a two-front war. So Germany had prepared for this. They had a battle plan ready to attack our shores. So a month after Germany declares war on the United States, the first wave of 5 U-boats, German U-boats, arrive off the East Coast, known as Operation Drumbeat. This is the first of many waves of operations that continued for months as German U-boats hunted merchant ships, which frequently sailed independently and at night, easy targets in front of coastal city lights. And at the start of the war, too, World War II, the U.S. Navy had too few destroyers and subchasers on hand on our coast to patrol, while also trying to escort those merchant troop ships across the Atlantic, which had devastating consequences for American coastal shipping. So, to really understand why our area, Virginia Beach, North Carolina, was um, so fruitful for the Germans, why so many ships were attacked here, you really have to look at the continental shelf. You can see it here in this map, how far that continental shelf projects out into the Atlantic Ocean, how close it is to land, and then how that deep water is right there. So it really kind of comes in very tightly off the outer banks of North Carolina. And the Germans knew the coastal shipping routes. They haven't changed in hundreds of years. They didn't change for the war. They're the same routes then, they're the same now. So they knew exactly where to hit us. So what they could do was hide in that deeper water in the continental shelf in the daytime, where it's colder, deeper, much harder to find and detect. And at night, they would pop up into the shallows and attack those coastal ships. Very easy pickings. And this coastal route of ships coming up and down the coast of these coasts was what was resupplying the war effort in Europe. It would all come up and down the coast and go to those big ports like New York, um, Halifax in Canada, Boston, and others. You would go to those main ports and then ship out. So that coastal shipping was the lifeblood for the Allied forces overseas. And Germany knew that by cutting that off, they could strangle the Allies into submission. So these are the shipping lanes, these lines here that you can see. There's really kind of these yellow ones with a little bit of red there. So you can see those are the shipping lights now, the shipping lanes, excuse me, that the coastal ships would travel on. They're exactly the same ones in World War II. So the Germans knew exactly where to hit us. And when we overlay the known World War II shipwrecks, the ones that have been discovered, all those little dots you see, all the greens and purples and reds, those are all the ships that were sunk by the U-boats. So you can see they're right in the shipping lanes. So again, Germany knew right where to hit us. So a lot of people don't know this, but during World War II, there are a total of 90 ships lost off North Carolina alone. So there comprises 78 merchant ships. Remember, those are the ships the Germans were targeting. 8 Allied naval ships, and these are primarily anti-submarine vessels. And then 4 German U-boats were lost as well, sunk by our forces off the East Coast. And of the 1,657 total World War II casualties off the coast of North Carolina, over 1,200 of these were merchant mariners. So historians call this America's second Pearl Harbor, except the difference here is that the enemy wasn't attacking another naval force. The Germans weren't attacking trained warriors and squaring off against battleships or aircraft carriers. They're attacking merchant ships with civilian volunteer crews. The U.S. Merchant Marine provided the bulk of these sailors, and many of these shipwrecks off North Carolina are graves for these brave men. During World War II, 1 in 26 merchant mariners died in the line of duty, suffering a greater percentage of casualties of war-related deaths than any other U.S. uniformed service. So North Carolina may have been where the Germans hit us hardest off the U.S. mainland, but it's also where we started pushing back. I think at the start of the war, when President Roosevelt said, "History has recorded who fired the first shot. In the long run, however, all that will matter is who fired the last shot." I love that quote. So North Carolina is where that road began for the Atlantic War. This is where we had the first victories against the Germans. So think of the coastal defense of the East Coast of the United States like a trident, with all 3 of the prongs had their first successes against the U-boats off our shores. The first of this was on April 14th, 1942, when the U-boat U-85 was sunk by the USS Roper off North Carolina, becoming the first U-boat sunk by the US Navy off the American East Coast. And in the picture here, you can actually see the remains of the German sailors that were collected on the surface. They're actually being buried at night in Hampton National Cemetery. And the reason they're being buried at night is because we didn't want the Germans to know we sank their U-boat. So they were given their military due in a military cemetery, but it was all kept hush hush, so the Germans would never know that we had actually taken one of theirs out. The second victory was on May 9th, 1942, when the U-352 was sunk by the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Icarus, becoming the first U-boat sunk by the U.S. Coast Guard of the American East Coast. And you'll see here in the picture, this is actually a great picture where you can see some U.S. Coast Guard and Navy personnel with a German officer that was captured on the surface of the water when the U-boat went down. He's being interrogated here in Charleston, South Carolina at the Navy Yard. And the third victory that we had off the mainland was July 7th, 1942, when Lieutenant Harry King Jr., who's in the photograph here pointing, in his A-29 Hudson airplane that sank U-701 off North Carolina, becoming the first U-boat sunk by the Army Air Force, which is the precursor to our modern Air Force off the American East Coast. And you can see the picture here. Here's actually Harry Kane with the pencil pointing on the map where he sank that U-boat on July 7th. Oops. So thankfully, by May of 43, the U-boats were no longer a major threat to Allied convoys. They now escorted coastal convoys and updated tactics by the U.S. Navy, and coastal blackouts were finally put into effect. And the sheer volume of American shipping had now turned the tide against the U-boat threat. And I truly believe that these first successes that we had off the coast of North Carolina, pushing the U-boats back from our shores all the way across the Atlantic, made D-Day and the Allied invasion of Europe possible on June 6th, 1944. If we hadn't had those first successes when we did in 1942 off the coast of Carolina, we would have never have had the freedom to move the men and material necessary for one of the largest amphibious assaults in history. So if you look at this map, this really shows it, how much material and manpower we needed to move, and that was all made possible because of those first successes we had pushing back against the Germans right here off our shores. So when we look at this area off the coast of North Carolina and the Outer Banks, we look at it like Gettysburg and Antietam battlefields. We truly have a battlefield sitting off the coast. This naval battlefield is where World War II came home to America. And what's really interesting about this area is that, for those of you that like to fish, we all know that shipwrecks are a great place for fishing, right? Lots and lots of fish there, but we haven't really imaged that or shown that before. So we at NOAA, using some of our cutting edge science and working with partners, are starting to image and understand that how we're showing now that these weapons of war have now turned into really oases of life, where they attract smaller fish and bait fish that attract the big predators, that attract the game fish, which make it so great for the recreational and commercial fishing communities to go out there and enjoy the sights. Or you could scuba dive and really enjoy them too. So they've really become an important part now of our local economies, and that's great. And we remember that history too of what these ships went through as they ended up on the bottom. So our goal with this research, working with our partners, is to help protect these fragile historic resources for the future and to preserve the memory of the brave Allied servicemen and the U.S. merchant marines who fought to rid the world of tyranny. And as we look at all of these shipwrecks and all of their stories, it reminds me that as Americans, we're not born into greatness. We don't seek it out, but we do rise when greatness is thrust upon us. And this is our story. And as we look to September and then anniversary of the end of the war, we remember that it's about celebration. It's about our troops coming home, our men and women coming home. There's a great picture of the famous British liner, the Queen Mary, arriving back in New York City, bringing back all those men back from Europe. And as we celebrate that greatest generation, the made America military and industrial leader, the world's most powerful economy, our troops came home, they got jobs, they started families, they created the baby boom generation. And these veterans helped create a time of prosperity and economic growth never seen before in the world. And at the close here, we want to make sure that we never forget all those that gave the greatest sacrifice so we could have our tomorrows. We honor all of their service and their legacy. So that's sort of come to the close of the presentation I want to show you, but we're ongoing working with our partners to try to honor and protect this battlefield, raise awareness, share the stories of folks just like yourselves. And we're really proud to be able to tell this story and share it with you today. And I'd be happy to, if you guys have any questions or anything, I'd be happy to answer them. Or any thoughts on World War II off our shores? Maybe you didn't know about this happened right here, but yeah, I'd like to hear what you think.
It's really loud.
Talk really loud.
No, no, it's really loud if you hold it up.
Hi, how are you? Yep, you're right. You weren't kidding. Have you had a chance to visit the Museum of the Atlantic by the Hatteras Ferry?
Yeah, actually, we've got a great partnership with the Graveyard at the Atlantic Museum. We actually have a monitor exhibit in there. We work really closely with those folks. They're a fantastic partner, and it's a great museum.
Yeah, I want to put in a plug for that for everybody here. And most people will not know that they actually have an Enigma machine that was recovered. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely. That was from the U-85. There was a private sports diver. I believe that he and his friends had worked the site for several years, and they were looking for the Enigma machine. So yeah, they did find it. They donated it to the state of North Carolina. So it's part of the state of North Carolina's collection now, and it's on display at the Graveyard at the Atlantic Museum. And there's another one too, by the way, an Enigma machine at the Mariners Museum and Park in Newport News, Virginia, that's on display as well.
Does anyone else have any more questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Casserly. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, no problem at all. It was great speaking to you folks. Yeah, please call us anytime in the future. You know, we also talk about the USS Monitor a lot in the Civil War and what that meant for the nation. So happy to talk to you folks at any time.
All right. Well, thank you. We appreciate your time, and hopefully we can come out to the museum sometime.
Yeah, please do. It's a wonderful experience, and you know, glad to show you guys the USS Monitor. Look at that turret in the conservation tank and what that meant for America.
All right. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Oh,
Oh,
one more
yep,
question.
yep. Absolutely.
What on earth is that little picture in the lower right corner of the screen? That was never explained to us that I recall, and I've been here for the whole thing, I think.
That's us. Are you talking about
No,
this
it's
one?
not. Yes,
That's us.
that's this room?
Yeah.
I'll be damned.
It's the picture of the room. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Casserly. We appreciate
Yeah.
your time today.
No problem, folks. Have a great day.